I think that's about. It's a great delight to be back here. It's a great delight to be back here. I remember being here about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's the audience has grown incredibly. Very fond memories of Pat. We had many happy times together, and it's a great honor to be giving you a talk in his honor today. The title covers everything, I think, so I think we've got a fairly open talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about cardiology, hormone therapy, and its effect on the vascular system. So I'll start by giving you my disclosures, which are there. And this clinic has been run by John and myself since 1993. So that means we're very old. And I found this, John, just the other day. We haven't changed a bit. Anyway, I think that's about 93, 94. Yeah, anyway, things have changed. But actually, deep down, we're all the same. So women and heart disease, this was the front page of Time back in the Iraq war was on. Is your biggest worry breast cancer? Think again. 1 in 3 women will die of cardiovascular disease. And this was a slide that was given to me by Phil Sorrell many, many years ago, which points out that women are living really way past the menopause, and age is one of the biggest risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease, something we can't do anything about, but we can modify other factors. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit on arteries, arteries that supply blood to the heart and brain, which are very important, and obviously other vascular systems. We've got 3 main coronary arteries, and this is what hopefully most of our coronary arteries are looking like. This is a scanning electron micrograph of the endothelial cells, and you can see a little platelet sticking to the orifice of one of the coronary arteries. This is something that that everyone's scared of. Atheroma is basically benign until it becomes malignant and you develop an event from it. So atheroma is developing in all of us as we age. And what we don't want is we don't want it to become inflamed and develop into a thrombotic problem. You can see here, this slide, I think, is quite descriptive. Atheroma can give you angina. It can grow in the artery and obstruct blood flow. But as you can see, the arrow bypasses angina, and a lot of patients who die of a myocardial infarction never have angina. Their first event is actually having a myocardial infarction. And that's caused by a coronary thrombosis, which then results in a myocardial infarction. And most people die of a myocardial infarction not because the heart fails, but because they get a fatal arrhythmia, such as ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. When does atheroma begin? Well, this is a very nice study that shows that it actually begins at an early age. And this is a study which looked at coronary arteries from transplanted donors, so basically hearts that were taken out of 13 to 50-year-olds, and they weren't used for transplant, but the workers in this study looked at the coronary arteries, and they found increasing evidence that atheroma develops even in our teens. And there are studies going on in Spain at the moment looking at very young patients with atheroma developing in their teens. So this problem doesn't just develop when we're 50, it's going on and it's related to risk factors. And the progression of atherosclerosis, basically there are growth factors, the endothelium can become impaired, platelets stick to the site, and when the endothelium is abnormal, then this is what happens. You get a thrombin develop and platelets stick, and then the plaque ruptures, and it ruptures like a volcano. I explain to patients that a myocardial infarction is like a volcanic eruption inside your artery, and it happens over 5-10 minutes, very quickly. You can see that the plaque is fissuring there. The underlying contents of the plaque are very thrombogenic, and within about 10 minutes, you have an occlusive thrombus and a myocardial infarction. So that's the acute, as it were, malignant phase of atheroma. And atheroma doesn't bother you, may give you angina, and if you're stable, that's fine. But what you don't want is an acute event. Unfortunately, as we age, and you can see in this slide from Nanette Wenger, coronary heart disease and stroke goes up an almost exponential curve as women transition through the menopause. And you can see there that the line for breast cancer is fairly flat, with hip fracture obviously going up with age. What are the risk factors? Well, luckily, most of them we can do something about. Age we can't do anything about, but we can certainly influence diabetes. I've highlighted hypertension there because that's often missed. Hypercholesterolemia, cigarette smoking, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, all of those things we can actually do something about, and we can attend to them and manage them aggressively. One thing I think that's really important is hypertension. We did a lot of work in 2000 showing that basically gynecologists weren't measuring blood pressure. And as you can see from this slide, it's not a great slide, sorry, around about the age of 50, about 50% of women have hypertension. And if you're not picking up 50% of your menopausal women having hypertension, then you're missing a really important risk factor. And this slide really reinforces the fact that risk factors are multiplicative. They actually synergize with each other. So if you're a smoker, have hypertensive and high lipids, then you're not just additive, you're actually synergistic, and your risk goes up exponentially. So having talked a little bit about what happens in arteries and what a heart attack is, what about hormones? What about estrogen? Well, there's very, very good evidence that estrogen is and should be very favorable to the cardiovascular system. There's a huge database for estrogen, releasing nitric oxide, reducing LDL, increasing HDL, releasing prostacyclin, inhibiting calcium channels, inhibiting endothelin and various other constrictors, acting as an ACE inhibitor. John and his colleagues showed that it's actually an ACE inhibitor. Perhaps one of the downsides is the thrombotic risk sometimes that is associated with hormones. But again, I think John will cover that. It's an antioxidant, very similar to vitamin C. So estrogen has potential to be very, very favorable. And we now know, of course, that there are genomic mechanisms and acute rapid effects of the hormone, which occur because of the receptor which resides on the plasma membrane. And we wrote this little article in Nature Medicine a number of years ago now, explaining why estrogen should have acute rapid effects via the receptor that resides on the surface of the plasma membrane. And I spent many a happy hour infusing estrogen down coronaries of both women and men in the 90s, putting little catheters down into the arteries, infusing estrogen. And we showed for one of the first groups in the world to show that estrogen could actually reverse constrictor activity of acetylcholine, showing that estrogen can actually release nitric oxide in human coronary arteries in the cath lab, which was very exciting at the time. The Boston group published about the same time as us. So there are lots and lots of basic and clinical data which support the fact that estrogen is and should be good for the cardiovascular system. So why is it then that this study came in 2002 and really messed the whole field for us? Well, the first thing is, in the title of this paper is the word healthy. And if you look at the constituents of the study, they were 63 years old, 70% were overweight or obese, 50% were hypertensive, and 50% were past or current smokers. So if that's an American healthy person, then so be it. Also, what is really interesting from the study, in the 98,000 women in the WHI whole initiative, 37% or 38% of them were hypertensive. And look at that, 64% were treated, 35% were untreated in a clinical trial, and only 36% of them were controlled. So it's not a wonder that the stroke risk was a bit strange in this study. But this was the thing that really messed up the whole field for 15, 20 years, and that is the way in which the WHI produced or published its data. It was first seen in the newspapers before any of us could read the JAMA publication. And in 3 or 4 years, what happened was that the realization that there was no statistically significant additional effect of hormone therapy for any combined outcome in the trial. And the results were really quite stunning in terms of how safe hormone therapy was for that really unhealthy population of women. If you look at the absolute risks per 10,000 women years in that study, you'll see that there are very, very few events. And one of the issues with the whole protocol was that they used nominal rather than adjusted statistic. In the protocol, they were supposed to use nominal statistics, which would have meant that coronary heart disease and even breast cancer was not increased. And if you look at the adjusted risks, they are not significant. And with these very, very small numbers, I think you cannot be confident really about any of it. But what I think is important to take away from this study is how safe even probably the worst HRT that they could have used was. This is a fantastic bedtime reading paper. I guarantee this is one of the best papers written about WHI and how it was conducted. It was by Bob Langer. He was very brave to write this, but do please read it because it gives a real insight as to how the WHI was conducted and managed. And this is how he ends. Critically, the facts that most women and clinicians consider in making the decision to use or not to use HRT are frequently wrong or incorrectly applied. And I think that's what happened with WHI. And we should have really learned from Tom Clarkson and his group. This is a group in the States that were experts at looking at atheroma in cynomolgus monkeys. And what Tom and his group showed for many years prior to WHI is that if you have a healthy diet and you oophorectomize these monkeys in the top line and you give them estrogen plus an atherogenic diet, you get a 70% reduction in atherosclerotic plaque. If you give them an atherogenic diet, oophorectomize them, and give them estrogen early after you've oophorectomized them, plus you continue the atherogenic diet, you still get a benefit. But if you have a healthy diet followed by oophorectomy and an atherogenic diet, i.e. WHI, and you give them continuous equine estrogen after 6 or 7 years, then you're not going to get a benefit. You've missed the boat. And so that really points to the effect of hormone therapy in the younger population who really need HRT. And that's where the study really should have been done. And when you look at the younger population, John will focus on this, I know. If you look at the 50 to 59-year-olds who take hormone therapy, you see that there's actually a trend to a benefit in WHI. So if you give HRT late, you're not really going to get a benefit, and you may get a prothrombotic effect and an acute event, but albeit very small. The choice of progestin is also being queried. MPA is an androgenic progestin. If you look at the combined study where CHD and breast cancer risk was slightly increased, and then you look at the estrogen alone arm of the study, there is a trend to a benefit. And I know that a lot of well-known workers have said many times that if the breast cancer events had been left for a bit longer, it probably would have showed that estrogen alone protected from breast cancer. And Tom warned us about this years ago. The data strongly suggest caution with the use of MPA. And this was a nice paper published by Phil Sorrell in the American Journal of Public Health. And I'll just read what it says, the results. And they looked at hysterectomized women after WHI, 50 to 59 years, over a 10-year span, so following 2002 WHI, a minimum of 18,000 and as many as 91,000 postmenopausal women died prematurely because of the avoidance of estrogen therapy. And I think that's what happened after WHI. It was a bit of a disaster. We stuck our necks out and published this tiny little study, but it was quite interesting. John was the senior author in this study, which was an MRC-funded study. And what we did was we took 100 postmenopausal women who had acute coronary syndromes, and we gave them the sort of doses of estrogen and the right progestin that we thought would be beneficial. So 1 milligram of 17-beta estradiol and 0.5 milligrams of NETA. And what we showed, it wasn't significant, but we showed a trend to a benefit in CVA, death, myocardial infarction, combined endpoint, and cardiovascular admission. Placebo is in red and on the right-hand side, and you can see HRT trends to a benefit. So even when you give hormone therapy to a high-risk population who just had an infarct, it didn't seem to give them any problems if you use the right dose, the right estrogen at the right time, and the right progestin. And just to finish on, what we've been doing in our clinic is we've been actually treating women with coronary heart disease and with non-obstructive coronary disease with estrogen and hormones when they need it. So we showed many years ago in the Lancet that estrogen acts as an anti-anginal. It's a very good anti-anginal, actually, and there's a lot of publications showing that definitively that estrogen can improve anginal symptoms. And this is a sort of a clinical scenario of the sort of patients that we see in our clinic. We see a 53-year-old woman, so she's been menopausal for about 3 years. She's getting frequent hot flushes and night sweats with angina and effort-related chest pain, angina over the last 6 months, occasional increases in blood pressure, and since the menopause. And this is a very familiar patient to us. She had a coronary arteriogram. It was completely normal, but as you can see on the right, it's the microvasculature that actually gives a lot of women at this age chest pain. And these patients are often ignored. As you can see, the coronary microcirculation accounts for about 95% of the control mechanism within the heart. And we showed actually that syndrome X, or microvascular dysfunction, peaks at around about the menopause. And it's estrogen withdrawal in some women that stimulates and produces this problem. And so microvascular angina, so not the big arteries, but the tiny arteries, is more prevalent in females, and we've seen that in a number of studies now. The prevalence of microvascular angina is estimated to be 30% of stable patients. And the reason I say it is you may see women in your menopause clinics complaining of chest pain. And they may have seen cardiologists who've done the coronary arteriogram, told them they're fine, they're clear, they've got clean arteries, but they may have microvascular dysfunction. And we see, literally, we've got a huge clinic full of these patients. And 10 to 25% of women with acute coronary syndrome have normal coronary angiography, which is a stunning statistic. And they're often diagnosed as having non-cardiac chest pain and often, frequently offered no treatment at all. So that's a mission that we've been on for 30 years to try and improve the awareness, both in the cardiological and the gynecological field with regard to this condition. And so our suggested use of hormone therapy, perimenopausal or early menopause, may be associated with syndrome X, we used to call it. We now call it microvascular dysfunction. if they are suffering from postmenopausal symptoms, hot flushes, fatigue, lethargy, and you can always find someone who's had a flush in the last 6 months, we often treat these women very successfully with low-dose transdermal estradiol and a non-androgenic progestin, dydrogesterone is one of John's favorites, I think, and or NITA. So that's how we manage these patients. And just to finish on, I think this still holds, this statement from the IMS in 2008. The perception is that HRT increases coronary heart disease risk throughout the whole postmenopausal period based on WHI, but HRT in women in age 50 to 59 does not increase coronary heart disease risk in healthy women and may even decrease the risk. And early harm was not observed in the early postmenopausal period, only in the older women. And the number of CHD deaths decreased with the duration of HRT in both WHI clinical trials. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for that rapid fly through cardiology. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Haytham. It's always good fun to speak with when my colleague Pete Collins is here, with the Royal Brompton's answer to the two Ronnies. What I'm going to do is just talk more about what HRT is doing. Pete's given you all the information about how the disease progresses and works and all the rest of it. There's my disclosures. So, cardiovascular risk in women. We've got genetic factors. Family history is always important. Ethnic origin is important. We've got metabolic disturbances, particularly diabetes, which of course is such a high risk for coronary disease, dyslipidemia, hypertension, lifestyle, socioeconomic status, which I've often mentioned in the past, that it's not just the socioeconomic status of the woman, but her coronary risk is also related to the socioeconomic status of her partner or husband. So an obvious preventive measure is divorce your husband and find someone richer. And then, of course, menopausal status is terribly important because premenopausal women, as long as they're not diabetic and they've not got familial hypercholesterolemia and they don't smoke, are pretty immune from coronary disease. So why is HRT so good? Because of the various metabolic actions that it has. And in lipids and lipoproteins, HRT is usually very beneficial. All forms of HRT will decrease total cholesterol because they all reduce LDL cholesterol, the harmful fraction of cholesterol. And they may increase the good type, the HDL, or sometimes they may decrease it depending on what sort of progestin you're adding to the estrogen. But they also can either increase or decrease triglycerides. And then they do a whole load of other stuff, which I won't go through, but basically these are qualitative changes in lipids that are all going to be actually very beneficial, increasing the clearance of the more atherogenic particles and so on. Insulin resistance is important. It's a very important factor in the development of coronary disease. And we know that oral estradiol improves insulin resistance very effectively. Low-dose conjugated equine estrogens have very little effect on insulin resistance. In the old days, the higher doses of conjugated equine estrogens actually used to make it somewhat worse. But the current doses, if anyone uses them anymore, are pretty reasonable, but they don't improve it, but they don't make it worse. Transdermal estradiol has a very small effect on insulin resistance. It can improve it to a small extent, but not as much as with oral. But then when you add the progestogens, this is what really causes a problem, that all androgenic progestogens all worsen insulin resistance, whereas the non-androgenic progestogens, such as micronized oral progesterone or the very similar dydrogesterone, really have no adverse effect on insulin resistance. And transdermal progestogens, even the androgenic ones, seem to have very little effect on insulin resistance as well. So route of administration, as well as the type of progestogen, is important. And we know from WHI and other studies, in fact, that HRT reduces the incidence of type 2 diabetes in postmenopausal women. And the WHI, this is the combined arm of the study, over 15,500 postmenopausal women followed for just over 5 years, and the incidence of new onset diabetes was significantly reduced by about nearly 30%. And it was even more greater reduced if you took the women who've been at least 80% compliant with taking the treatment. So we can safely say that HRT actually is good for preventing type 2 diabetes, and therefore that should feed back onto improving coronary risk. Body composition is also important. HRT, you know, you get the patient say, I went on HRT and it made me fat. Yeah, and I get patients coming to me saying, yes, I went on HRT and it made me fat. You know, it's those hormones that have done it. And I say, well, you must have been dipping your hormones in chocolate because, you know, it's just not true. So if you actually go onto HRT and measure body fat, there's no increase in total fat, and there's a relative decrease in the male pattern of fat, around your middle. As men keep our war medals. And it's the android fat. You get a relative decrease with HRT, which is good. So you're getting a redistribution of body fat with HRT. And it's the android fat that you want to get rid of because that's the one that's related to adverse metabolic changes, and hence it's related to increased coronary risk. So if you're giving HRT to people who are overweight or even obese, then which should you be giving? At the moment, there seems to be a great thing that everyone's saying, oh, you've got to give transdermal estrogen. That's the only way to give estrogen. Well, it's not. You know, there's nothing wrong with tablets, and a lot of people actually prefer tablets to patches and gels. And if you give, with women who are obese, you can give them oral estrogen, and you'll get a better increase in HDL cholesterol, you'll get a better improvement in insulin resistance, but it may be the expense of increasing triglycerides, and of course oral estrogen does increase the risk of venous thromboembolism, and if you're obese you've already got an increased risk for that. Whereas transdermal estradiol actually reduces triglycerides just by itself, and you don't get any increase at all in venous thromboembolism. So that's good, but you get less of an increase in HDL and less of an improvement in insulin resistance as compared to oral therapies. So, you know, all therapies can be good. They've all got good points and bad points, and you shouldn't just write one off against the other. Blood pressure, Pete has mentioned how important blood pressure is and how often it's overlooked, and we often wonder whether people who are measuring blood pressure, are they doing it properly? I mean, these days it seems that everyone wants to put a machine on someone rather than just put a cuff around them and have a listen. Because that's a very good way of measuring blood pressure. It's not a lot can go wrong with putting a cuff on somebody, put it around the arm rather than around the neck. But you should be able to measure your blood pressure okay with that. But these people that are using these fancy machines, and we don't really know, some of them are very good, but some of them aren't. And so you've got to be a bit careful on that. What does HRT do? I mean, unfortunately, there's still this mentality that if you're on HRT, if your blood pressure goes up, oh my God, it's the HRT, you must stop it straight away. And the truth is that an increase in blood pressure is an incredibly rare event with HRT, and it's really an idiosyncratic response, so it happens straight away. So if you put somebody on HRT and you measure the blood pressure, it's okay, and then 3 months later when you recheck them, the blood pressure's gone up, then it might well be the HRT that's at fault. But for most women who are on HRT and after 4 or 5 years, their blood pressure has started to go up, and some well-meaning but idiotic cardiologists, present company accepted, of course, will say, oh, you must come off this HRT, it's making your blood pressure go up. No, it's not. You went on the HRT years ago, it's nothing to do with it. Blood pressure goes up. As you get older, blood pressure goes up. As you get fatter, blood pressure goes up. If you listen to general elections, your blood pressure goes up. So don't try and relate it to HRT, and don't just stop it because the blood pressure has gone up. It's usually nothing to do with the HRT. Okay, so let's just finish off by looking at coronary events. And, you know, this is something that good, or partly good, that came out of WHI. And this is just showing the events in those women taking estrogen alone, that in those initiating the HRT below the age of 60 actually showed a non-significant reduction in a hard endpoint of myocardial infarction or death. They showed a significant reduction in terms of coronary interventions, bypass grafting or percutaneous coronary interventions. And if you combine those two as a composite outcome, which is often done in cardiology studies, they often use composite outcomes, then that's a significant reduction. Whereas the women starting the HRT above the age of 70, you didn't see that reduction in any of those outcomes. But more importantly, you didn't see any increase. There wasn't any harm being done, you just didn't see the same benefit. And when they did the final sort of outcome, when they did the follow-up at the end of the study, and they followed them for a number of years, and what they found was that with time, so those that had been given estrogen alone at the age of under 60, compared with women given placebo, these women ended up with fewer and significantly fewer coronary events, whereas we didn't see that in the older age groups. But again, no increase in events. We just didn't see the decrease that we saw when you started it early on. And there are reasons that you can explain that. This study was the Denmark study. This was the Danish osteoporosis prevention study, where Louise Scherberg actually was a young cardiologist and actually thought, oh, this is an interesting population these bone doctors are looking at. Wonder what their hearts are doing. The bone doctors sort of, what's a heart? And these women randomized to oral estradiol with or without the cyclical norethistran acetate, depending on if they had a hysterectomy or not. And this trial it was a randomized clinical trial. It wasn't placebo-controlled. It was randomized to either no treatment or the HRT. And they ran the trial for 10 years, and they stopped it when the WHI study results were first published. But they then did an observational follow-up of a further 6 years after that. So it's 1,000 women, yeah, small number, but they've been followed for a long time and been watched for a long time. And what they found was that for a composite outcome of myocardial infarction, coronary death, or admission to hospital with heart failure, that composite outcome was significantly reduced in the women who were randomized to the HRT rather than the no treatment. So a significant reduction, and quite a big reduction at that. And interestingly, they also noticed, so talking about 16 years of observation, no increased risk of stroke, VTE, or any sort of cancer, including breast cancer, with the HRT. And I think those are very reassuring findings. Yeah, I mean, according to some of the other studies, which I won't mention, but for the sake of the story, we'll call the Million Women study. You would have expected these women who've been on HRT for 10 years, they should have been bursting out with breast cancers all over the place, and they just didn't see it. And more recent study from our good friend Howard Hodis in Southern California, who looked at the idea of starting HRT early or starting it late, this so-called window of opportunity. And Howard did this study, over 600 women, studied up for 6 years, and there were women that were either within 6 years of the onset of menopause, or a second group who were beyond 10 years post-menopause. And he randomized them to oral estradiol or placebo, and they gave them vaginal progesterone if they needed an endometrial protection. And their outcome they was looking at was ultrasound of the carotid arteries, measuring intermedia thickness. And this is a very useful sort of surrogate endpoint to look at. And what he found was that there was a significant reduction in the progression of this thickening of the arteries in those women that were starting the HRT within 6 years of the onset of menopause, but they didn't see it in the women who were starting it beyond 10 years post-menopause. Again, no evidence of any increase or any harm, but just in the older women didn't see that same benefit. And this is one of a couple of meta-analyses that have been done. This one, I've chosen to show this one rather than the other one. This is from Shelley Salpeter and her colleagues, again in Southern California. And I thought it's useful for this audience because Shelley Salpeter is a GP. So she does these amazing, huge meta-analyses, 39,000 women. She's doing these analyses on the data from these women. And what she found was that women starting on HRT below the age of 60 or within 10 years of onset of menopause, looking at myocardial infarction or cardiac death, there's a significant reduction, quite clear significant reduction in these women. Whereas the women starting the HRT above the age of 60, it was there wasn't a reduction. It wasn't an increase, but there wasn't a reduction. So I think that this study is interesting in two ways. First of all, that it's showing you really quite robust evidence that HRT can be beneficial. And the other interesting thing is, how can a GP find the time to do huge meta-analyses like these? She obviously has very understanding patients. And the last one I want to show is from Tommy Mikkola and his colleagues in Finland. And I always like to show this because I'm sure you've heard me say this before. This is looking at coronary heart disease death. And death is just the ultimate endpoint. Because you can argue about what constitutes a myocardial infarction and was there ST depression and all the rest of it. You can't argue about death. You're either alive or you're dead. End of story. Yeah? So this was a good study from the Finnish registries, with 90,000 postmenopausal women, and the women who had been started on HRT below the age of 60 had a significant reduction in coronary heart disease death, whereas women who started above the age of 60, there was a reduction, but it wasn't statistically significant. But it's just reinforcing this point that you're certainly getting benefit if you give it at the right time, but even if you don't give it early enough, you're not actually causing any harm. So before the event, after the event, you can still do good. And this study, Pete showed you his data from the Brompton about myocardial infarction, the WISP study that we did, giving it to people who basically had acute coronary syndromes, and showing that certainly didn't do any harm and looked like it was doing benefit. This is an observational study from the United States, but it's a big study, 115,000 postmenopausal women with confirmed myocardial infarction. Just 6% of them were on HRT. But if you looked at the survival following the myocardial infarction, the ones on HRT had a significantly better survival than the women who were not on HRT at the time of the myocardial infarction. So it's an observational study, and I've been trying to work out how can we do a randomized clinical trial. It would be nice to do it, but how do you recruit women who are intending to have a heart attack? And lastly, if a woman's had a heart attack, can she ever be given HRT? And this is a question that had been asked time and time again to the British Menopause Society, and they asked me to look into this. And so with Pete and our friend Howard Hodis from the States, we actually have published this on this. It's on the BMS website, and it's now just been published in the Post-Reproductive Health, looking at hormone replacement therapy after myocardial infarction. And if you want to know what the answer is, well, you can look on the website or read the paper, but I can tell you anyhow. Basically, yes, of course you can. Now, this idea that, and again, I'm afraid it's probably most of the cardiologists will do this, that if a woman has a heart attack and she's taking HRT, stop it straight away. You must stop the HRT. And the evidence for that is zero. It's not a shred of evidence for it at all. Why did they do it? It was just sort of, oh my God, you've had a heart attack. We must do something. What can we do? Oh, you're on HRT. Let's stop that. Well, what's the point? None whatsoever. So I think it is safe to give HRT to women who've had a myocardial infarction, and we tell you why it should be safe in the article. We tell you about the mechanisms involved. We show you the biological plausibility, which I think is always so important to be able to demonstrate. And the answer is, yeah, just give the right dose of the right type of hormones at the right time after a myocardial infarction, and you're okay doing that. So in conclusion, coronary heart disease is a major disease for women. We used to show a slide where we said, you know, coronary artery disease, an equal opportunities killer, because as many women die from coronary disease as do men. And prevention is certainly doable. It's very, very feasible. It includes lifestyle modifications, and it certainly includes the underlying risks. Treat those. You know, as Pete mentioned, particularly things like blood pressure, which are so easy to treat, and you can make such a big impact in risk reduction with this. I believe the totality of the current data we have does indicate that HRT is beneficial for the prevention of coronary events, but this benefit will depend on the types of hormones that you're giving, particularly on the progestogen, and we'll always, wherever possible, go for a non-androgenic progestogen. The dose of hormones is important, depending on the age of the woman. If she's around the age of 50, you can stick her on a standard dose of estrogen. But if she's on her late 60s, then we're tending to go for a very, very low dose, you know, cutting patches into quarters and stuff like that if necessary to achieve a very low starting dose. You know, you can then titrate the dose up once you've got the woman onto it, give her 2 or 3 months on the treatment, and if necessary, just increase the estrogen, you know, for whatever reason you've wanted to put her on HRT in the first place, you know, if it's control of vasomotor symptoms or whatever. So those are the important things that we've got to consider. But overall, yeah, estrogen gets the thumbs up as far as arterial events is concerned, and in terms of prevention and even treatment, HRT, if given properly, is good stuff. Thank you very much.